Thank you for tuning in today's episode of Law Explained. Today we're going to be talking about prohibition of drugs or illegal substances. To start us off, while some drugs are illegal to possess, many governments regulate the manufacture, distribution, marketing, sale, and use of certain drugs. For instance, through a prescription system. For example, amphetamines may be illegal to possess if a doctor has prescribed them. Otherwise, possession or sale of the drug is typically a criminal offense. The most widely banned substances include psychoactive drugs, although blanket prohibition also extends to some steroids and other drugs. Many governments do not criminalize the possession of limited quantity of certain drugs for personal use, while still prohibiting their sale or manufacture or possession in large quantities. Some laws or judicial practice set a specific volume of a particular drug above which is considered ipso jure to be evidence of trafficking or sale of the drug. Some Islamic countries prohibit the use of alcohol. Many governments levy a sin tax on alcohol and tobacco products and restrict alcohol and tobacco from being sold or gifted to a minor child. Other common restrictions include bans on outdoor drinking and indoor smoking. In the early 20th century, many countries had alcohol prohibition. These include the United States, 1920s to 1933, Finland, 1919 to 1932, Norway, 1960 to 1927, Canada, 1901 to 1948, Iceland, 1950s to 1922, and the Russian Empire / USSR, 1914 to 1925. In fact, the first international treaty to control a psychoactive substance, adopted in the 1890s, actually concerned an alcoholic beverage, Brussels Conference. The first treaty on opium only arrived 2 decades later, in 1912. Definition: drugs, in the context of prohibition, are any number of psychoactive substances whose use a government or religious body seeks to control. What constitutes a drug varies by century and belief system. What is a psychoactive drug? Well, examples include a range from caffeine found in coffee, tea, chocolate, nicotine, and tobacco products, botanical extracts, morphine and heroin, and synthetic compounds, MDMA and fentanyl. Almost without exception, these substances also have a medical use, in which case they are called pharmaceutical drugs or just pharmaceuticals. The use of medicine to save or extend life or alleviate suffering is uncontroversial in most cultures. Prohibition applies to certain conditions of possession or use. Recreational use refers to recreational use refers to the use of substances primarily for their psychoactive effect outside of a clinical situation or doctor's care. A government's interest to control a drug may be based on its negative effects on the users, or it simply may have a revenue interest. The British Parliament prohibited the possession of untaxed tea with the imposition of the Tea Act of 1773. In this case, as in many others, it is not a substance that is prohibited, but the conditions under which it is possessed or consumed. Those conditions include matters of intent, which makes the enforcement of laws difficult. In Colorado, possession of blenders, bowls, containers, spoons, and mixing devices, it is illegal if there was an intent to use them with drugs. Many drugs, beyond pharmaceutical and recreational uses, have industrial uses. Nitrous oxide, or laughing gas, is a dental anesthetic, also used to repair whipped cream, fuel rocket engines, and enhance performance of race cars. Some early drug laws were the Sharia law, Islamic, which is usually attributed to its passages in the Quran, basically the Bible for Islamic people, dates back to the 7th century, although Islamic law is often interpreted as prohibiting all intoxicants, not only alcohol. The ancient practice of hashish smoking was continued throughout the history of Islam. Against varying degrees of resistance, a major campaign, hashish eating Sufis, were conducted in Egypt in the 11th and 12th centuries, resulting in many other things in the burning fields of cannabis. Though the prohib- though though the prohibition of illegal drugs was established under Sharia law, particularly against the use of hashish as a recreational drug. Classicist jurists of medieval Islamic jurisprudence accepted the use of hashish for medical and therapeutic therapeutic purposes, and agreed that its medical use, even if it leads to mental derangement, should remain exempt from punishment. In the 14th century, the Islamic scholars, as Zarkishi, spoke of the permissibility of its use for medical purposes if it is established that it is beneficial. The first modern law in Europe of regulating drugs was the Pharmacy Act of 1868 in the United Kingdom. There had been many previous moves to establish the medical and pharmaceutical profession as separate, self-regulating bodies. But the General Medical Council, established in 1863, unsuccessfully attempted to assert control over drug distribution. The Act set controls on the distribution of poisons and drugs. Poisons could only be sold if the purchaser was known to the seller or to an intermediary known to both. And drugs, including opium and all preparations of opium and poppies, had to be sold in containers with the seller's name and address. Despite the reservation of opium to professional control, general sales did continue to a limited extent, with mixtures less than 1% of opium being unregulated. After the legislation passed, the death rate caused by opium immediately fell from 6.4 million population to 4.5. Deaths among children under 5 dropped from 20.5 per million to 12.7 per million, and further declined between 6 and 7 per million in the 1880s. In the United States, the first drug law was passed in San Francisco in 1875, banning the smoking of opium in the opium dens. The reason cited was many women and young girls, as well as young men of respectable family, were being induced to visit the Chinese opium smoking dens, where they were ruined morally and otherwise. This was followed by other laws throughout the country and federal laws that barred Chinese people from trafficking in opium. Though the laws affected the use and distribution of opium by Chinese immigrants, no action was taken against Americans. The distinction between its use by white Americans and Chinese immigrants was thus a form of racial discrimination, as it was based on the form in which it was ingested. Chinese immigrants intended to smoke it, while it was often included in various kinds of generally liquid medicines, often, but not exclusively, used by Americans of European descent. The laws targeted opium smoking, but not other methods of ingestion. That is going to be all today. That was an explanation of drug laws and the history of prohibition of drugs. Thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to the next episode. I hope you can tune in. Thank you.